Welcome to The Kingstonian, a podcast that profiles people who are passionate about what they do for a living, what organization they belong to, or the community they are a part of. Here is your host, Dave Cunningham.
If you've been a fan of live music in Southeastern Ontario at any point over the last 40 years, you'll know the name Georgette Fry. Many of her fans would agree that she bridges the gap between jazz, soul, blues, and gospel with the power of Etta James and the rasp of Bonnie Raitt. She continues to develop stage shows that showcase her talents, and along with her solo efforts, she has spearheaded the organization of choirs in over 24 communities, offering women the opportunity to get together and sing. Shout's sister is 20 years old this year and continues to thrive. In this episode, a conversation with a woman who continues to hit the right note, Georgette Fry. George, welcome to the program.
Hey, David. I'm glad to be here.
It's been a long time since you and I have sat down and had a chat.
Yes, and a long time since the first time we met.
I know. I can't even think about how long ago that was.
It has to be 40 years. I think it has to be 40 years.
I think it's 50 years. Probably.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
I know. It's just crazy. One of the things I wanted to start off with is we are recording this in mid-February 2022. We are slowly starting to come out of the pandemic. And I'm asking this question as someone who doesn't sing, who doesn't play an instrument and just consumes the art, the music. And I'm asking you as someone who provides that art, what it's like not to be able to perform live in front of an audience for this long.
It's awful. I can't think of a word strong enough to describe just how adrift we all feel, because we can't. I actually had a little illegal driveway concert last July, where, three friends came and we socially distanced at the top of my driveway after having a couple of quiet rehearsals in my backyard. And we sort of spread the word in the neighborhood, and people came and they stood 6 feet apart. And we put a can out front and raised $330 for the Kingston Food Bank. But, the Kingston has this bylaw that says that you're in violation of the bylaw if you have any kind of amplification going on. And that's 24/7. It was instituted decades ago to stop the noise in the Queen's Ghetto, right? Mm-hmm. So legally it means that if you're driving down Princess Street with your window down and your radio on, you're in violation of the noise bylaw. Yeah. So the idea was that if we got busted for playing live music in the driveway, we could use some of the money in the can to pay fine. But it turns out we had $300 to give to the food bank. And and we did it just because, that was the first lockdown. So imagine going through a second one after having actually played. And then just going into, what date? It was last fall, I think just before the long weekend. Cliff Edwards had us perform in Gananoque at the Thousand Islands Festival. And again, everybody on stage was at least 10 feet apart, I guess. And the audience was good. They were masked, and for the most part, they were socially distanced. And all that does really is to amplify how badly you're missing that contact with the audience. It's, it's all I've ever lived for, pretty much. Well, children, but there's my kids.
Can't forget those, yeah.
No.
I've spoken to a lot of different musicians over the past couple of years, and I get the sense that they've used the opportunity to create inside their own homes, and you have the gear now that you can do that reasonably easily with, and it sounds good. But it's the business of getting up in front of a crowd and having the feedback from the audience that's been missing. It's almost like a drug in a sense that you need that
Exactly.
when you're
Yeah,
performing.
I did 20 years of being the house band at Brandy's. Every week I got to stand up in front of a room full of receptive people and have that. It is a communication. Like anytime I've been in the studio doing the final vocals on a project, I've always wished that I could have, 50 of my favorite fans on the other side of the glass so that I could sing to them and
Right.
feel the energy. Right? So, yeah, it's a completely different beast trying to do this from your home. And kudos to those people who have managed to do that, to record little house concerts and send them out virtually and so on. It doesn't appeal to me.
Mm-hmm.
It just doesn't. So,
And there are quite a few people who do get up on Facebook Live and do mini concerts. And it seems to work for them, but I would guess that it doesn't work for everybody. Let's talk about this beast and where this beast first manifested itself as far as you're concerned. Where did the desire to sing start?
my parents tell the story of when I was like 4 years old. They took me to a circus in France. And I'm not sure where my brother was, but my sister and I were sort of happily listening or watching all the animal shows. And this woman came out in a white dress with long white gloves and sat down on the longest white grand piano I've ever seen and started to sing. And my parents told me that I just suddenly, my focus just sort of went zoom. And the woman's name was Gloria Lasso, which I found really fascinating. A few years ago, I went to see the McGarrigle sisters on their book tour because I had read their biography. And oddly enough, when they were children, they used to gather around the radio at home and listen to Gloria Lasso. So here I was in France watching Gloria Lasso, and my dad said that they literally had to pry me out of the chair at the end of the show because I wanted her to come back.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, from that point on, I came home and I sat down in front of, we had a great big Grundig stereo that had a record player in it and the radio, that floor model thing, the hi-fi. And my dad said I sat down in front of that and they couldn't get me to go outside and play anymore. I just wanted to listen to music. And so he started bringing home stuff like Elvis Presley. And he was a big country and Western fan, so Ernest Tubb and Hank Williams and Hank Snow.
All the originals, yeah.
All the originals, yeah. I still have the Elvis Presley album. 1959 pressing, I think. The one with Lottie Miss Claudie and Blue Suede Shoes, and the British pressing. So
I think we all remember the first albums that came into our household as a kid. There were two that I remember. One was an album by Trini Lopez. Remember Trini?
Yeah.
If I Had a Hammer. And the other was Mitch Miller and the Gang.
Oh gosh, yes.
They weren't my choices, but those were the ones that came into the house.
Yeah.
Now, so you develop an affinity for music. You enjoy listening to music, and it becomes a fixation where you want to listen to this all the time. What about the business of converting that into you getting up in front of an audience and singing?
Well, that was most of the things that have happened that have sort of shaped where my life has gone have been happenstance. Like back in 1970, I came to Kingston in 1976, 75. And in 1976, I was working with the penitentiary service in personnel. And we used to, some of the girls and I would go up and play volleyball on Saturday afternoon. Then we'd end up down at the Manor. And of course, they had that amateur show going on, right? And at one point, they put my name in. And I got up. I wanted to do Linda Ronstadt's When Will I Be Loved?
Mm-hmm.
And the band didn't know the song. And it's always been the case that unless I've rehearsed with somebody, you can hear my knees knocking across the room. So at one point, I turned around to the band. We were halfway through the song and said, "You guys don't know this one." And I left the stage. Well, there was a pedal steel player playing with Bill Jocelyn at the time named Bruce Hamilton. And I guess Bruce and Bill had been talking about splitting away from the group they were in called the Woodchuck Brothers back then with my friend Tom Case. Anyway, and Alan Weeks. So Bruce went back to Bill, and because Bill had said, maybe we should get a female vocalist. And so Bruce went back to Bill and said, I found our female vocalist, but I don't know who she is. And he said he went back to the Manor for 6 straight weeks until I got back up on stage, and he walked up to me and said, do you want to be in a band? And I said, okay, what do I do? Right. So I went over to Bill's house. I took my guitar and I played a couple of country tunes because right then it was country rock, right? So we were looking at doing Eagles and Emmylou Harris and Pure Prairie League and Poco and all those amazing, the International Submarine Band, all those wonderful things. Anyway, so I played a couple of songs for Bill, and I'll never forget, he looked at me and said, well, I definitely think you should be in a band. I'm just not sure if it's going to be this one. So I went home and thought, oh my God, what have I done? And the next day he phoned and said, so when can you start rehearsing? And that was it. That was the first band I ever got into. Up until that point, I mean, I played my guitar in the bathroom at high school,
Yeah.
And I never really learned anything about playing the guitar, except I knew how to shape the chords that I wanted, and I would ask people to teach me the songs that I wanted to learn, like, The House of the Rising Sun or whatever the hits were. But yeah, up until that point, I wasn't at all seriously thinking about a career in music.
So you never performed in front of a crowd up until you started doing those open mic sessions?
Well, not really. I mean, before that, I'd worked in Ottawa, and I think I had gotten up at with a band at the Chateau Laurier Hotel. I worked there coming out of high school. But no, I had my first public performance in kindergarten at the Christmas pageant. I guess the teachers had said to my parents, this girl's got a voice. So I got up and did What Child Is This for the Christmas pageant. That was my first public performance. And after that, it was basically in Ottawa. I remember going on the local cable TV station, doing a show. And the guy coming on right after me was, still then, an unknown Murray McLaughlin, right? So we're going back. I was 16. Oh, yeah. It was a long time ago. Yeah.
The Farmer Song.
Yeah.
Murray McLaughlin, among others. Down by the Henry Moore. Yeah. I remember Murray. Used to play him when I worked in radio years and years ago. Okay, so we didn't really talk directly about this, but you grew up in a family that moved around a lot because, what was it, your dad who was in the military?
Yeah, my dad was in then what was called the Air Force.
Right.
Yeah. Every 4 years, somewhere new.
And where were you going when you were moving around?
First stint was in France. So from the age of 4 until 8. And then we came back to, I was born in northern Quebec. I was born in Saint Jerome because my dad was posted up at Lac Saint-Denis. And so we went over to France, came back, and ended up in a new subdivision in Ottawa. Stayed there for 4 years, and then by the time I was 11, we went back to France. And then during that period, that was when Charles de Gaulle decided that he didn't want NATO in the country anymore. So we went to Germany for the first year that LAR opened up. And then came back to Ottawa. So I think finally, when we came back to Ottawa the second time, I was in high school. And that's when we finally settled down, right? Yeah. My parents moved to Picton in 1973, and I got married the first time. And but then I ended up moving to Kingston in 76. And then I went to London, Ontario from 87 to 94, and then came back to Kingston because Kingston is the place I've lived the longest, and I love it here. I don't think I'll ever leave it, even though it's beginning to piss me off a bit how big it's becoming, right? My precious town. When I first moved to Kingston, Princess Street was nothing but Chinese takeout pizza joints, and I think the most, it didn't even have a grand theater at that point. But I think Chez Piggy was, at that point, was the canoe club, and it was big. So I've watched Kingston become just the best place, between Montreal and Toronto.
Mm-hmm. I know we moved around quite a bit when I was a kid, and we ended up in Kingston in 1966.
Wow.
And I finished off high school here. But I can remember driving down Bath Road, and there was virtually nothing on Bath Road except for the car dealer next to the Frontenac Mall before the Frontenac Mall was built. And
Right.
across the street, what we affectionately call Disneyland, which was the College Bay
Yes.
Penitentiary.
The
But
Red
virtually
Roof Inn.
nothing else on that road. And
Yeah.
like you say, it's certainly grown quite a bit and continues to grow quite a bit. So, there's lots of changes that have been wrought here, but it's still a community that we enjoy living in, for sure. When you moved back to Kingston and settled here and started playing in bands, so if Bill Jocelyn's band was the first band that you became a part of, we talked about that being a country rock sort of format that you were playing in that band. Other bands and other musicians that you would have played with in Kingston along the way?
Yeah. Once, let's see, at some point, in 1981 is when my first child was born, my first boy. But before that had happened, we had kind of gone from a country rock format into a blues format. And I remember we had a B3 player, Colin Banger, had joined the band. And it's amazing how everybody disappears when it's time to load that thing up in the truck, right? So I got introduced to kind of blues music back then. And so after my first child was born, Bill and I went back as a duo and played quite a while. And that was a lot of fun too, because that's when my horizons began to open up, and I would listen to more folk music and I remember Jeff Green back in the he was my drummer, our drummer back in the late 70s, and he introduced me to Bonnie Raitt. And of course, I've been a huge fan of hers forever.
Mm-hmm.
I've been a fan of blues music and what they called R&B when I was a kid, and I listened to Etta James and all those people way back in the 60s and 70s. But so Bill and I did a duo thing, and then my ex finally, he was working on his PhD, and he finally had to get a job. I'd never considered that we would ever have to leave Kingston again. So anyway, we ended up in London, Ontario, and I was lucky enough to know musicians there who basically took me around, introduced me to all the finest players in town, so I didn't have to go to the bars every night of the week to find the best players. And before I knew it, I had 3 bands. I had one called the Diamondback Boogie Band, which was an R&B rockin' kind of thing, blues. I played in an exceptional country blues trio with fingerstyle guitar players. It was unbelievable. That really, really stretched my horizons, because before that, I basically hadn't listened to anything before Robert Johnson. So here I learned all about, Blind Lemon Jefferson and Willie McTell and all these, and Charlie Patton, who started it all. So that really broadened my horizons. And then when I lived in London, so yeah, I had 3 bands on the go. I finally had to trash one of them because I just didn't have time. I had 3 kids.
Mm-hmm.
And then I would come back to Kingston twice a month to play, which was kind of cool because I'd get in the car, line the coffees up on the dash, and kids would stay home, right? So, and I got to listen to music uninterrupted, and I was 4.5 hours on the road. And so I did that. That was when I got into playing with Bob Robertson and Grant Heckman in a little trio called Eclectricity. And they too, they were just doing songs that they loved. Damn the genre, the pigeonholing, right? People could just come out and listen to a wide range, and everything had harmonies. I'd first seen them, I was in town playing my gig at the Grad Club with my band that had Dirk Clancy and Jim Preston and Tim Mavidi, you know, and Bob Robertson played bass in that one too. But I stayed behind for something or other, and Bob and Grant had a little duo called Heckman and Robertson, and they were playing at the Slip at the Holiday Inn. And I popped down, and I'm sitting there at my table adding a third voice. I knew a harmony to every single song that they played, so they said, well, come on back tomorrow night and sit in. So I did. And at the end of it, Grant said, well, congratulations. He said, I can't hear this stuff now without that part, so you're in the band. So that was why I came back every 2 weeks. I'd come back to do a gig with Electricity, and then 2 weeks later I would do a band had my band at the Queen's Grad Club. So, and then, but I always, from that point on, I didn't stray much beyond blues and just pop music that I liked. But when I got into Electricity, I started looking more at singer-songwriters and stuff too, right? So, because we were covering Tom Waits and Los Lobos, and so it gave me a chance to cover stuff by, you know, people like Nancy Griffiths, and of course a lot of Bonnie Raitt. So, yeah.
One of the things that came up as you were telling this story, and that's the fact that if you talk to a singer-songwriter, they feel at some particular point that they have stuff they want to get out. They want to put something down on tape or on computer, digital, whatever the format is. But it's a case of, this is something that's inside. I want to get it out. And it doesn't matter to me what genre it ends up sounding like when it comes out. This is my stuff I want to get out, and I put it out there. And if somebody likes it and streams it or downloads it or whatever, then I'm happy. When you are performing in a bar, for instance, I would think it more difficult to try to throw in original tunes or tunes from artists that people don't know too much about because they don't recognize the song. What kind of reaction have you got from audiences on that particular score?
Yeah, that is interesting, because I think, like, I wrote my first song in London, Ontario, and it sort of fell out of the sky and into my coffee cup, and I thought, wow, that was easy. And then I discovered just how hard it is to write songs. You know, you don't often get those gems that fall out of the sky, but there are a couple of stories that I can tell. The first one being, like, when you're in a blues bar, I can't tell you, it's almost every week you get at least a couple of people saying, do you know Mustang Sally? And so I wrote Let Me Drive as my perspective on Mustang Sally. And of course, every week somebody would be having a birthday. So I wrote my birthday blues so that we could do an actual blues song instead of Happy Birthday to You, right? And the other story I like to tell is on my Let Me Drive CD, there's a song called I Found You Out. And most singer-songwriters, I mean, the only way to make it authentic is to use something of your own experience. You can't really write about something you know nothing about, right? But I had gone down to, I can't remember what it was called then. I think it was called the Dukes, I think, down on King Street, to hear my drummer and guitar player in a band called General Jones. And I was reaching between two women sitting at the bar to get my whiskey. And this was back in the days when you could still smoke in bars. And as I reached through, I heard the one woman say to the other, every time it happens, he's got some excuse. And I thought, ooh, that kind of tracks nicely. And back in those days, I used to just write these ideas down on the tab on the top of my cigarette pack. And I had a bucket full of these things at home. But so I would take that and go, every time it happens, baby, you got some excuse. Some old worn-out reason for playing fast and loose. And that's the start of it, right? And then you start to build the song around it. And then the other one that I found, so playing this stuff in front of an audience, I've always been a strong believer that that if you try chasing what you think the audience wants to hear, you'll never make them happy, because there'll always be something else that you don't know yet, so you better go and learn, kind of thing. And you end up being a human jukebox.
Yeah.
So when you start to write, I mean, there's always that you never really feel confident about what you've written, but you've got to put it out there. And of course, I was surrounded by amazing musicians. And that's the other thing, too. When you write something, you have an idea what you think it sounds like until you give it to these musicians like Zach Colbert and Jim Preston, who have their own take on it. And suddenly it sounds way different, right? So, but when I wrote The Exile, which was on my first CD, that's a song that reflects the years I spent in France listening to French music.
Yeah.
And I thought, wow, that doesn't fit in a blues repertoire at all. But the FM radio station here in town played that song 2-3 times a day for years. And it's one of my favorites, but it's nothing like anything I've ever written before. So, yeah.
You just never know.
Yeah, and I rarely played that one on the bar circuit. But, I found the audiences were pretty receptive to my originals. But it is a scary thing bringing them out. Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about Rites of Passage.
Yeah. The song itself?
Or the album, just recording the album.
The album was a blast to record. I think we broke a land speed record recording that one too, because it was done within a week. Grant Heckman produced it, and by the time we went to Toronto to get down to the business of recording, everything was in place, and everything went really smoothly. We had, there were several kind of one-take wonders. I remember going into, when we did the Pee-wee, whatever his name is, Peace of Mind. I found Peace of Mind. Mark Haynes and I were maybe 10 feet apart in the same room with kind of our baffles for our microphones, because we wanted kind of that live feel of us singing it together. And so we thought, well, okay, we'll try this experiment. And so Mark and I were facing each other 10 feet apart, and we both thought this was the rehearsal. And so we went through it, and at the end of the song on the CD, you can hear me giggle. And after that, I had said, okay, let's take one. And Grant said, no, we just did, and that's the one. Right? So, yeah, so it was just a blast. I had been in the studio. I'd been in Doug McClement's studio in Toronto with Bill Jocelyn, recording the album that came out a couple of weeks before my second son was born. No, actually, I recorded the vocals 2 weeks before he was born. It came out later. But, so I wasn't a stranger to the studio, but this was my project. Right? So, and I figured I might never get a chance to do another CD. I'm just going to put this one out there, and I'm going to put anything on it that I want to record. Yeah. So that's why, I had to put that little blurb on the back about pigeonholing, because that was the only criticism I got was from the industry saying, we can't file this anywhere, right? It's not country, it's not blues, it's not rock, it's got everything. Yeah. And to quote Emmylou Harris when she did Wrecking Ball, she said, why isn't there a category that's just called good music?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So but the song Rites of Passage itself, Ian Tamblyn wrote that. And he had dedicated it to me from the stage at a music festival and somewhere in the London area. I can't remember where it was exactly. But anyway, I asked him after that, I said, can I have a recording of that song? So he gave me a cassette. And I decided that, I loved the song so much. And I didn't tell him I had recorded it. And so when the album was done, I took a copy of the master up to Ottawa because he was playing at the Great Canadian Theatre Company. And I hid out up in the back in the little, the area where the AV people sit, the techs. And I had a blaster sitting on the back seat in the top row of the audience. And Ian was on the stage setting up all of his guitars, and I just snuck out and I hit play. And he heard the first couple of chords, and I saw him sort of stand up and look around, and he looked terribly perplexed. And then finally he heard my voice, and then I stepped out of the room, and he came running up. He said, "Oh my God," he said, "I was worried that I had stolen somebody's song." He said, "And then I heard you sing, and I thought, who is that? Bonnie Raitt? Who is that?" So that was, I'll never forget that. That little video runs in my head all the time. It's just a beautiful song. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's the story behind the title, the album title.
Let's go ahead a few years to 2002. And you're sitting somewhere watching a movie. Yeah. And you get some inspiration from that movie, and it leads to something really big, really important. Tell us about watching that movie.
Yeah. I had been, when I came back to Kingston from London, I knew I wasn't going to make enough of a living just playing gigs. So I started teaching private voice coaching, right? And one of my students arrived for a voice lesson the morning after, or the afternoon after I had just sat down and watched Whoopi Goldberg's Sister Act. And Joy came in the house, and I said, "Oh my God, I just watched Sister Act last night. Boy, wouldn't it would be so great to put together an all-female kick-ass choir." And she said, "Why don't you do that?" And I said, "Well, I can't run a choir. I can't read music. I've never read music, and I wouldn't know, where to get the stuff." And so on. She said, "Well, you've been teaching for 13 years. Don't you think you could just sort of extrapolate that to a larger group?" I thought, well, that's an interesting idea. So I said, I'll give that some thought. She came back 2 weeks later for her voice lesson and said, "I have 10 women who will join your choir." And I said, "All right, get me another 10 and I'll do it." And then I went out to British Columbia, out to Hornby Island, to teach a voice camp at the blues camp out there, teach a voice pod. And that was back in the days before we had, when we still had to dial home on our landlines to get our messages. And so I would call home, and there would be like 15 messages from women saying, "I hear you're putting together an all-female choir, non-reading choir, and I want in." And so I thought, okay, well, I'm going to have to think about what to do here. So I thought, what is a song that almost everybody knows or is familiar with? And I thought, if I can get 50 women going home after 2 hours singing a song in multiple parts, then I think maybe I can do this. But they would have to learn it by ear, because I realized at one point, actually I was driving home from a gig with Zach, my bass player, and he put Aretha's Gold on the cassette in the car, and I thought, and I hadn't listened to that album in maybe 30 years, but I remembered every little nuance that Aretha had sung. And I thought, that's what happens. It goes in the brain and it gets stored in there. So I can't be the only person in the world who has learned every song by singing along. And so that's what got me thinking about it. So the very first night, before the first night of choir, I quickly arranged The Rose, Amanda McBroom's The Rose, in 5 parts. And 50 women showed up for the introductory session. And sure enough, they all went home after 2 hours knowing a lead part, a low part, a high part, and a couple of response parts. And so the next night, I had arranged to have 2 nights of introduction. And the next night, 70 women showed up. And so I immediately had to look for a larger room. And so that was it. September of 2002, this thing began. And for the longest time, I actually have a hat around here that says "That Choir" on it, because we didn't have a name. Women would approach each other in the streets in Kingston and say, "I hear you're in that choir." So, and it wasn't until I thought, well, you know what? let's tip our hats to Sister Rosetta Tharpe here, who had a big hit with Shout Sister Shout. I thought, so let's just call ourselves Shout Sister. But then, so about 4 years into it, I realized, this would be a way that other musicians could, pad their income a little bit without having to take a job that involves, would you like fries with that? So I thought, if I can do this, any woman who works in an ensemble on the stage, be it an actor or a musician, would understand what it is I'm doing. And so at that point, Jody Benjamin was the first musician I approached in Ottawa. There was a woman up in Haliburton who came on fairly early in the days as well, because I had gone up to do a choir stream at their camp in Haliburton. And then it just started to grow from there. And before the pandemic hit, there were 25 choirs around the province with about a dozen directors. So yes, it's been an amazing journey. Just an absolutely amazing journey. And we now have pushing 150 songs that I've arranged over the last 20 years. And I figure once we hit 200 songs, maybe I can retire.
Mm-hmm.
I just keep circulating them, but I have the best job in the world. I direct 4 of my own choirs right now. And I spend my days with GarageBand, just arranging songs, finding the right key for them, and just exploring music that has good melodies and stuff, right? Mm-hmm. So, and it's all predominantly peace, love, and understanding music, because that stuff is never out of fashion. And and so now, after we're about to lift restrictions now, but I still have about 60 or 70 women in the Kingston Choir, the Kingston Evening Choir, and around 50 or so in Brockville, 50 or 60 in Picton. Yeah, so, and an afternoon choir in Belleville.
Now, with respect to the participants in the choirs, there is more for them in participating besides the music.
Definitely. Yeah. Anytime I hire a new director, I have to just be adamant about the fact that this is as much about community as it is about the music. It's an organic process, and I want the women to connect with one another. There have been some wonderful spin-offs, theater groups and book clubs and stuff. But so while we're singing at choir practice, everybody is singing all the time, because I've made it so that the lead singers, they're pretty familiar with the new song before they come to practice the next week. And then I pan the harmonies off to one side or the other, so the lows can stand in front of their speaker and the highs in front of their speaker, while the leads keep singing. And we're singing all the time, because in more traditional settings, 1 or 2 groups has to sit there quietly while another group gets their parts properly. So it's more of it's a social thing, and it also is very much a community fundraising organization. It started, years ago. I think it was Andy Rush's Open Voices who convinced us to perform in the first place. When I first started it, I thought, well, if we're all amateurs, nobody's going to want to perform because they'll be too frightened. So Andy said, Open Voices is doing a show. Why don't you guys come and open for us, do 3 or 4 songs? And so I asked the women, and they said, oh, well, okay. So we rehearsed the hell out of, 4 songs, and we got up to perform. And when it was all over, they were immediately hooked. Like, oh, that was such a buzz. Of course, standing up in front of an audience and hearing applause is amazing. So the second fundraiser that we did actually was when Stephen Lewis came through town on his book tour, and it was a huge show. And from that point on, the women just said, okay, that's it. We have to raise money. We have to raise money for Stephen Lewis's fund. And then I said, okay, well, that's good. So I brought out what I called the African. It was just an empty can. And every week somebody would throw their Tim Hortons money into it. And we raised thousands of dollars to send to the Stephen Lewis Foundation. And then I thought, well, I think it's wonderful to raise money for all kinds of international, the groups that don't get a lot of funding from the governments and so on. But then I thought, locally too, there are a lot of groups that don't get funding from the United Way or whatever.
Yep.
So I thought, why don't we do a show every year that raises money for a local initiative? And so things like Street Smart for the kids who are out of school and trying to get their high school diploma, the food banks, anything that involves women and children specifically. So yeah, that's been every year we do a show in June, and we find a local charity to give the money to.
Mm-hmm.
And we love it. We'll just and anybody who ever asks, we're quick to jump on doing any kind of fundraiser for.
Something I wanted to mention before we started recording, you were showing me a video. And this is a video that was done during the pandemic, I gather, because you can't get your group together. And so I think you said there were 30 women involved in this video.
I think so, about 30, yeah. Yeah.
And what I like about it is the fact that it was professionally produced after the singing was done, is that you had somebody package it so that it looks awesome. Yeah. And just the vibe in doing that, because that's different from putting the women together in the same room singing together. Now you have 30 women who are in their own homes wearing their earbuds, singing a song by themselves, which is then packaged together. And just the change in getting them to do that, because that's much different from what they would normally do.
Yes. Yeah, it's quite frightening to listen to one's own voice isolated from everything else, right? Mm-hmm. Because that voice was then separated from what they were listening to in their earbuds. And so the backing track was then put underneath. And the guy who did it, Joel Saunders is his name, he would then have to line up their lips to synchronize with the parts. When I first saw, the first example, the directors had done one to put on the website of a Canadian piece. And I thought, oh, what a cool editing suite that is. And I almost thought, I want to get into that. And I thought, no, George, you don't have time, because this is what I like to do is arrange the songs. And I thought, if I do that, I've never done Facebook or Twitter or any of those things, because I think of them as a time suck. I want to devote as much time as I can to listening to music, finding the music, arranging the music. And I'm really lucky because I have access to all these amazing musicians in Kingston who record the tracks for me for the choirs. But yeah, so this editing suite, we had I think there were 6 or 7 pieces that were done by the various choirs around Ontario, and they're all amazing. They're all different songs, and they're all amazing. So it was a huge step forward for many of the women in the choirs who were terrified to do it. Mm. So, yeah.
Now, is this video available for other people to watch, or is it just something that's in your private library?
Well, the women in the choirs who performed on these videos actually paid, because we had to pay the guy who did the editing, right?
Yeah.
So they paid to be in them. Yeah. And so given that, they have every right to own a copy of them. And they were all sent copies. And so, and yes, I have all of the originals because they were all recorded under the auspices of Shout Sister.
Yeah.
So yeah, people who request them, I'll send them to. But the one that my group did, we now have a new website, and I believe it might be posted on the website. I can't say for sure because I haven't. But yeah, I think if you Google Shout Sister, you'll find the website. And if it isn't up there yet, I'll make sure that it gets posted up there, but I'm pretty sure it must be there by now.
Okay. I want to read something that I read about you. And this is the way it goes. This particular award that you received in 2017 from the Governor General, no less, reads, "This is for a deed or an activity that has been performed in a highly professional manner or according to a very high standard, often innovative. This deed or activity sets an example for others to follow, improves the quality of life of a community, and brings benefit or honor to Canada." The Governor General's Meritorious Service Medal, and you received that in June of 2017.
Yeah, what a surprise that was.
Tell me about the phone call. I read something about the phone call.
Yeah. I thought somebody was pranking me, punking me, whatever they call that, right? The phone rang, and the woman on the end said, "This is the Governor General's office calling." And I said, "Yeah, right." And she said, no, it really is the Governor General's office. And I said, "Okay." And she said, "You have been selected for this award." And I thought, holy bleep. How did that happen? So it turns out that it was one of my Picton members who had initially approached the Governor General's office and said, "This woman deserves an award for what she's doing here." And they wrote back and said, "Yeah, this is kind of an interesting concept. So if you can get like 5 letters of support, we'll put it in and see what happens." So yeah, unbeknownst to me, 5 women wrote amazing letters of support, and this is what happened. So when it came time to decide who to take with me to Ottawa for the ceremony, I thought, well, I've got 3 kids and best friends and so on, but it just makes sense to take the women who put me forward for this.
Yeah.
So we all went up to Ottawa, and it was an amazing day. Just an amazing day. Yeah.
I have a question. I have a question. Maybe you don't know the answer to this, but how many times does the woman making the phone calls from the Governor General's office get the same sort of reaction?
Yeah, right. Yeah. It reminds me of the story of Bonnie Raitt calling Shirley Eichhardt about, let's give them something to talk about. Apparently, Shirley Eichhardt picked up the phone and the voice said, "Hi, it's Bonnie Raitt." And Shirley said, "Yeah, right," and hung up the phone. Right? And Bonnie called back and said, "No, really, it's Bonnie Raitt. I want to talk to you about your song. Let's give them something to talk about." And Shirley said, "Well, I'm sorry, but I just sold it to Jennifer Warrens." And Bonnie said, "I'll worry about Jennifer. I'm getting that song right." So that was a very funny story too.
That's a perfect lead into my next question, which is Georgette Fry and her First Rate Band, which is, I gather this is a tribute to Bonnie Raitt and her songs.
Yeah.
And how many times have you got to perform this? I noticed there was a plug for it at the Cove Inn or something, and the show was canceled because of a storm or the pandemic or something.
Pandemic has pretty much put that project on hold. We have several songs sort of, drafted up, and all we need is a couple of rehearsals to take it out.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll have to see what happens when they start lifting the restrictions. But yeah, I mean, I did, when was that? It took place over about 4 years. I did I hate the word tribute, because tribute bands, they try to dress like and sound like and put on a show like. But I did what I called a retrospective of Etta James's material.
Mm-hmm.
She's also been a huge influence on me. And so we did several shows of that. And basically we've, Bunny Stewart was my musical director, and he mapped out all of the medleys that we did, and it was one of the most fun things I've ever done. Plus, I mean, I got to have an 8-piece band and 3 backup singers, and brought in 50 choir members to do the big gospel finish kind of thing. It was a blast, but it's far too expensive to put into theaters. So, but yeah, and I've always covered at least a few songs that Bonnie Raitt has covered in any band that I've been in. And so I thought, that would be something that I would like to do at some point. The other project that I've always wanted to do was a whole evening's worth of beautiful ballads. But, people keep saying, oh, you can't do that. People will just slash their wrists. But, ballads are just some of the most beautiful pieces of music ever written. So yeah, I'm really looking forward. I keep hearing rumors that maybe the restrictions will be all gone by around the middle of March.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you're going to see a whole bunch of musicians, white as sheets, emerging from their darkened studios to get together. And the last time before the second lockdown happened, I did get together with the band members out at our drummer's studio, Duncan Holt's studio. And we were working up the repertoire for the Bonnie Raitt thing.
Yeah.
So now, yes, hopefully it'll happen.
Over the years, you said you've listened to a lot of different music, recorded by a whole bunch of different people. And I'm wondering if there ever was a song or is a song that you have yet to perform live that's been at the back of your mind that you just haven't had the opportunity to sit down and think about how you would interpret the song.
Actually, yeah. My son, John, my middle son, he's 38 now, I guess. And he's a working musician in Montreal. He teaches, he plays drums, piano, guitar, bass, and has a little studio there now. And he sent me something that he was working on. When John was 4 years old, he knew every word to Warren Zevon's Excitable Boy album, because it was one of my favorite albums. And he sent me a little recording of himself doing Accidentally Like a Martyr, one of my all-time favorite songs. So he sent that to me. And I thought, wow, this is weird, because that is one song that I've never played live. And I've always loved it. It's always been one of my favorite songs. And I've always loved Warren Zevon's music. But so, yeah, that would be one song. But Bonnie Raitt didn't cover it. So it's probably not going in the next band. Unless I just carry on doing what I'm doing and just keep adding Bonnie Raitt stuff. And maybe I'll start looking at some more Warren Zevon. Because I love his music. But I also would, like, for a while I played with Bob Robertson in a country swing band. We did Bob Wills and lots of Texas swing.
Love that kind of music.
Oh yeah, me too. Remember Asleep at the Wheel?
Oh yeah.
Love
Route
their
66. Stuff. I like that, their version of that tune. Yeah.
And I did a ballad with Bill Jocelyn, Nothing Takes the Place of You, that was on one of their albums. But the other band that I've absolutely adored my entire life is, here we go with the 68-year-old memory, Dan Hicks and his Hot Licks. Right, so I would love to have a band. It's kind of a blend of what we call Romani or gypsy music and swing, and it's just really different stuff. I remember my oldest boy, who's now 40, walked into my apartment in, where was it, my house on York Street in Kingston. And I was cooking him some dinner, and I had Dan Hicks and his Hot Licks on the stereo while I was working, and he walked in, he said, "Who is that?" And so he immediately borrowed all of my CDs, right? So, yeah, I love that kind of stuff. I love anything from New Orleans. I like Zydeco and Cajun and, just you name it. Anything that has that New Orleans feel. So that's another project I would have loved to have done, was the Ladies of New Orleans or Louisiana. because there's so many fabulous singers that have come out of there, Irma Thomas and Ann Peebles and even contemporaries that you see them all on Trim A. So yeah, that would be another project. I'm getting too old to even think about all this stuff, David.
Well, it's nice to hear that the creative juices are still whirling around in that brain of yours. And I know that there are folks all over still interested in hearing you perform, and looking forward to the day when we can get into some performance venue and enjoy the music that you kick out and enjoy the music that the choir kicks out as well. So I want to thank you for all your time this morning. Enjoyed the conversation. It was good to get back in touch with you, and all the best going forward.
It's been a big load of fun, David. Nice talking to you again, too.
If you're interested in checking out the video that Georgette and I spoke of, go to the liner notes for this episode. Once again, sincere thanks to Georgette for her participation in this profile.
The theme music for the podcast is Stace's Oasis, written and performed by Kingston musician Tim Aylesworth. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions about any of the episodes, please send a note to thekingstonianpodcast@gmail.com. For details on upcoming guests, follow us on Facebook. The Kingstonian Podcast is hosted by Dave Cunningham and produced in Kingston, Ontario, Canada.